Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Inside your skull right now is a 3-pound piece of wet tissue, just sitting in absolute darkness.
Right.
And it regulates your breathing, it computes complex mathematics, and it feels, existential dread all at the exact same time.
Yeah, it's busy.
It really is. But despite being the absolute center of human existence, the text notes that scientists freely admit we're still completely ignorant of how it actually pulls this off. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are acting as your personal tutors, guiding you step by step through Chapter 1 of Introduction to Neuropsychology.
Exactly. Our mission today is to explore the foundational concepts of the discipline, basically in the exact order they appear in the text, to break down how we study this machine that runs our lives.
Because it is essentially the ultimate locked room mystery.
It really is. Neuropsychology is the discipline that tries to bridge that massive gap. It seeks to understand the relationship between the physical brain, the biology, and observable behavior. The core theme we're unpacking today is that studying human psychology, our thoughts or our learning without any reference to the underlying physiology is just an incomplete picture.
Right. You can't just ignore the hardware.
Exactly. You simply cannot grasp human behavior without asking what physical mechanisms are operating in the background and how changes in that physical tissue alter who we are.
So if we're trying to figure out how the physical tissue creates behavior, how do researchers actually get in there and study it? Because, we can't exactly take apart a healthy living human brain just to see how the gears turn.
No, we definitely can't. Which is why the field fractured into different approaches to solve that exact problem. So the oldest and most foundational branch is clinical neuropsychology.
Good.
This deals exclusively with brains that are broken. Researchers look at patients who have suffered actual brain lesions. So, whether that's from a disease, blunt trauma, or even surgery.
Right. So they're looking at what went wrong.
Exactly. The goal is to measure their specific deficits to aid in diagnosis and rehabilitation. And within that clinical branch, there's a subfield called behavioral neurology.
And how is that different?
Well, instead of running massive statistical studies on hundreds of patients, behavioral neurologists focus deeply on individual cases. They look at the qualitative, conceptual deviations from what we'd call normal functioning.
So, to use a car analogy, clinical neuropsychology is like trying to understand how a vehicle works by exclusively examining cars that have been in crashes. That's the clinical side.
That's a great way to put it.
But what about intact brains? Because you can't only study broken cars, right? You'd want to test drive brand new cars on a track.
Right, and that's the experimental side. Experimental neuropsychology is a much newer field, really taking off in the 1960s. They study completely healthy, intact brains in laboratory settings.
So how do they do that without, drilling holes?
They give subjects performance tasks, so they measure the accuracy and the exact speed of their responses to infer how a healthy brain is organized.
Okay, so clinicals are the crashes, experimental is the test track. But then there's the third branch the chapter mentions, which brings in animal studies. Comparative neuropsychology.
Right, exactly.
And the massive advantage here is obvious. You can introduce a precise, anatomically confirmable lesion in an animal subject to see exactly what behavior changes. You know exactly where the damage is.
You do.
But the disadvantage seems equally massive. You can't study high-level functions like language or, reading in a rat. Plus, human brains have completely different cortical distributions. So if animal studies can't test human-level cognition, why do we still do them?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the text notes a growing integration between animal and human studies, because animals fill a critical gap that we just cannot ethically cross in humans. Mapping subcortical systems. These are the deep, older structures below the brain's surface mantle that handle basic life support. So, sensation, emotion, sexual behavior.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, if you purposefully damage those subcortical regions in a human to see what happens, you risk causing radical interference with their life or even killing them. So for those base biological systems, we rely on animal studies, and then we integrate those findings with the human cognitive research.
But that brings us to a massive philosophical wall. Because even with clinical patients or healthy volunteers or rats in a maze, we rarely get to watch the brain processing a thought directly.
Right.
We observe a behavior, a test score, a delayed reaction time, and researchers have to work backward to guess the underlying brain state. The text calls this the inference problem.
It is a massive hurdle. You're essentially seeing the shadow on the wall and trying to draw the object casting it. And that inference problem leads to an even deeper philosophical hurdle, the classic mind-body problem.
Right. Are the mind and the physical body fundamentally different things?
Exactly. And modern neuropsychology largely accepts a position called emergent materialism or emergent psychoneural monism.
Okay, let's unpack this. Emergent materialism.
So it rejects the idea that the mind is some separate spirit hovering inside the body. Mental states are brain states, but, and this is crucial, they can't be reduced merely to single cells.
Which brings up the exact analogy from the text, which I love. The sweetness of an apple.
Yes.
If you look at an apple under a microscope, there is nothing in the physical structure of that apple that possesses sweetness.
Right, you just find carbon, water, sugar.
Exactly. Sweetness emerges when the whole object interacts with the eater. Is that basically what we mean by the mind?
That is exactly it. The mind is a collection of emergent bioactivities. And adopting this philosophy is vital because it allows researchers to study lower-level physiology like blood flow or electrical spikes without losing the higher-level concepts of thinking and feeling.
So we acknowledge the biology, but recognize that the integration of all those parts creates something greater.
Precisely.
So historically, now that we have this philosophical framework, how did researchers actually try to map these emergent functions onto the physical brain?
Well, it was a very long, messy road. I mean, you can trace it back to 2500 BC in Egypt with primitive trepanning.
Literally drilling holes in skulls.
Yeah, literally. But the first real systematic attempt didn't happen until the 1830s with Gall and Spurzheim. They founded phrenology.
Oh, right. Measuring the bumps on the skull to figure out someone's personality.
Exactly.
There's that hilarious detail in the text about Professor J. Millett Severn reading bumps at the Brighton Phrenological Institute for 2 shillings and 6 pence. It just sounds so absurd now.
It does sound absurd, but phrenology was actually incredibly important conceptually. It planted the idea that psychological characteristics could be broken down into individual components, and that those components might live in specific physical areas of the brain.
Oh, I see. So it paved the way for the real science.
Right. Which led to the monumental breakthroughs of the 1860s. Paul Broca demonstrated that a lesion in a very specific area of the left frontal lobe severely interfered with a patient's ability to produce speech.
So the patient could understand language, but couldn't speak it.
Exactly. And shortly after, Carl Wernicke found a different area where damage destroyed the ability to understand speech, even though the patient could still talk.
Which seems like a slam dunk for the idea that specific brain areas do specific things. But those discoveries led to 3 competing historical theories, right?
It did.
You have the localizationist theory, which argued that specific functions live in specific places. Then you had the equipotential theory, championed by Lashley and Goldstein, which argued the exact opposite, that the whole brain functions as one unified mass, and the amount of damage matters more than the location.
Right.
And the third was the interactionist theory, from Healings, Jackson, Loria, and Geschwind, saying higher functions are built from basic localized components linked together.
Exactly, a network.
But wait, if Broca proved localization by finding the speech center, why did equipotential theory even survive into the 20th century?
Well, because the clinical evidence from brain injuries is incredibly messy. Doctors were finding that brain damage at totally different physical sites could sometimes produce the exact same psychological deficit.
Oh, so they thought, well, if I break it here, or here, or here, and the reading breaks every time, the whole brain must be involved in reading.
Exactly. However, the interactionist theory, specifically this concept of regional equipotentiality, became the modern consensus because it solves that contradiction beautifully.
How so?
Think of reading. Reading isn't one localized function. It requires a visual center to see shapes, a language center to translate shapes into sounds, and a memory center to attach meaning.
Right.
Those are highly localized components, but they interact in a network to form the complex intelligence of reading. If you break the visual center or the language center, the network fails and you can't read.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It explains why damage to different areas causes the same deficit.
Exactly.
So as this interactionist theory took hold, particularly after the brain injuries of World War I and II, clinical neuropsychology developed 3 distinct global approaches to testing these networks in patients.
Right. First, you have the North American approach. This is characterized by systematic batteries, like the Halstead-Wrighton battery. It's highly quantitative, heavily standardized.
But the weakness is that it's super cumbersome, right? It's like forcing every single patient to take the SATs, regardless of their specific injury.
Yeah, it can be very rigid, and it's based heavily on models of normal functioning. In sharp contrast, you have the Russian tradition, heavily influenced by Luria.
And that's behavioral neurology, focused on single cases.
Yes, there's no standardized battery. The clinician uses informal, unstandardized tests based purely on their own skill to assess functional systems.
And then there's the British tradition, which sits kind of right in the middle. It focuses on individual cases, but it uses standardized tests selected pragmatically. So you don't give the whole SAT, you just pick the specific sections that make sense for that patient.
Exactly.
The text actually uses the exact phrase scientific detective work to describe the British method.
I love that phrase. And the British approach is largely becoming the dominant international style due to the rise of cognitive neuropsychology. But the core principle across all three traditions is the same. They all rely heavily on the clinician's intellect to interpret the data and ultimately to help patients rehabilitate and circumvent their handicaps.
So that covers the clinical side detective work on injured brains. But how do experimental psychologists study the healthy brains of normal subjects in the lab?
A lot of it relies on something called stimulus logic, and the anatomical basis for this is contralateral mapping.
Right, the left brain controls the right side of the body and vice versa, and they're connected by the corpus callosum.
Exactly. So researchers designed tests to isolate one half of the brain at a time, like the divided visual field presentation. If you flash a word to the far left side of someone's peripheral vision, it hits the right hemisphere first.
So by measuring the reaction speed, they can map which hemisphere is specialized for what.
Right. And they do the same with hearing dichotic listening. They play different audio tracks into the left and right ears simultaneously to see which hemisphere dominates processing. They even track lateral eye movements and handedness.
But eventually they want to actually see the brain working, right?
Yeah.
Which brings us to specialized techniques.
Yes, physiological scans, like RCBF, regional cerebral blood flow. Active neurons need more oxygen, so blood rushes to the active areas. By having a subject inhale a harmless radioactive gas, they can track the blood flow in real time.
And EEGs tracking electrical activity via average evoked potentials.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because the text mentions the WADA test.
Ah, yes.
They inject sodium amytal into the carotid artery to put half the brain to sleep. Wait, really?
Yeah.
How is shutting down half the brain an experiment on normal subjects?
Okay, let me jump in right there. The WADA test is never done on normal subjects. Ever. The risks are way too high.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah, it is strictly clinical. It's only done on patients preparing for major neurosurgery, so the surgeons know exactly which hemisphere handles language before they operate.
Okay, that makes infinitely more sense.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, observing those extreme clinical cases provided the foundation for testing healthy people. The 1960s revival of split brain operations, where they literally severed the corpus callosum to treat epilepsy, allowed researchers to pioneer those lateralization inferences we now use on healthy subjects.
So with all these physiological tools, we reach the most recent developments from the 1970s. Cognitive neuropsychology.
Right. This approach essentially creates flowcharts of human abilities. Let's say single word reading. They map out the boxes and arrows of the cognitive process to find out exactly where the system breaks down in a patient.
And the text outlines two forms of this. The soft form, which uses actual brain anatomy as a guide for the flowcharts, and the hard form.
Yes, the hard form.
Which totally ignores brain anatomy and focuses purely on psychological processes. Okay, let's unpack this. Isn't a branch of neuropsychology that makes NO reference to the physical brain an oxymoron?
It is a massive point of contention. It's highly debated. The hard form's main value is really in theoretical research, building logical models of cognition rather than practical clinical work.
Because in a clinic, you're dealing with a physical injured brain.
Exactly. And speaking of ignoring physical reality, this leads to what the chapter calls the fringe, the dark side of lateralization research.
Right. Pop psychology running wild with the left brain, right brain stuff.
It's wild. Claims that right hemisphere consciousness is the voice of gods, or using hemisphericity to explain massive cultural differences.
Or dictating that we need to change educational systems for right-brained thinkers.
Right. And the text gives a stern warning here. These fringe ideas go well beyond scientific evidence. They can be actively harmful if they're turned into actual social policy.
So what does this all mean? We've covered an incredible amount of ground. Neuropsychology is this evolving, deeply inferential science. It blends clinical detective work with experimental rigor to solve the ultimate puzzle. how the mind emerges from the physical brain.
It really is the ultimate puzzle, and I want to leave you with a final thought inspired by the chapter. We talked about emergent materialism, how the mind is an emergent property created by the physical brain interacting with its environment, just like the sweetness of an apple.
Ready?
So if that's true, how might our minds fundamentally change as our external environment becomes increasingly virtual and digitally mediated?
Oh, wow. That is a fascinating question. If the environment changes, the emergent property has to change too.
Exactly. Something to think about.
Definitely. Well, on behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you for studying with us today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you in the next session.